Welcome to Kipabhavan Daily Reflections. What then will this child be? The narrative of John the Baptist's birth in Luke 1 verses 57 to 66, 80 is deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, culture, and scripture. To read it merely as a miracle story or a New Testament novelty would be to miss the profound connections it holds to Israel's story, covenantal faith, and prophetic expectation. Every element, from Elizabeth's barrenness to John's naming and his time in the wilderness, echoes motifs familiar to first-century Jewish hearers and readers, who would have recognized in this account the unmistakable hand of God working within the framework of their sacred history. The joy of a barren woman. Luke begins this segment by telling us that Elizabeth's time to give birth had come, and she bore a son. The joy of this moment is not only personal but communal. Her neighbors and relatives rejoice with her, recognizing that God had shown her great mercy. In Jewish tradition, barrenness was often perceived as a source of shame or even divine disfavor. This is seen in the stories of matriarchs like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and especially Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. In each case, God's intervention in granting a child served as a signal of divine blessing and the initiation of a larger, covenantal purpose. Elizabeth's story is thus not isolated. It resonates with the pattern of God's miraculous provision to women whose children would go on to have significant roles in Israel's redemptive history. The joy expressed by the community is not just delight in the birth of a child, but awe in the recognition that God is once again intervening in Israel's story.
Circumcision and the naming of John. The narrative then shifts to the 8th day, the day prescribed by Torah for the circumcision of male infants, Leviticus 12 verse 3. This act is not merely a medical or familial tradition, it is a sign of the Abrahamic covenant, an indelible mark that identifies the child as a son of the covenant people. Circumcision is, in Jewish thought, both a sign of belonging and a dedication to a life under God's law. It is at this sacred moment that the question of the child's name arises. Traditionally, it was common to name children after their father or a close relative, reinforcing family identity and lineage. When Elizabeth declares that the child will be called John Yachanan in Hebrew, meaning Yahweh is gracious, her decision is met with confusion. The name is not part of their family tradition. But it is divinely appointed, given earlier by the angel Gabriel. In Jewish thought, names carry weight. They often reflect character, calling, or divine intention. By breaking with familial expectation and obeying the divine directive, both Elizabeth and Zechariah affirm that this child's identity is determined not by human tradition, but by divine commission. Zechariah, still mute from his earlier doubt, confirms the name by writing it on a tablet. In doing so, he finally aligns himself with God's plan. His speech is immediately restored, and his first act is to bless God. This moment mirrors a deeply Jewish understanding that when the heart turns back to God in trust and obedience, healing and restoration follow. Zechariah's regained speech not only confirms the truth of the angel's message but also signals that God is again speaking through his people. Awe and prophetic expectation. The response of the community is telling. Luke writes that fear came on all their neighbors, and that the story spread throughout the hill country of Judea. In the Jewish worldview, fear in this context does not imply terror but reverence and awe, a typical reaction to divine acts. This is the same fear of the Lord extolled in the Psalms and Proverbs as the beginning of wisdom. The people recognize that something significant has occurred, something that points to God's movement within Israel once more. Their question, "What then will this child be?" is not just curiosity but a theological reflection. They are aware of their scriptures. They know the prophecies. Malachi had spoken of a messenger who would prepare the way of the Lord, someone who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah, Malachi 3 verse 1, 4:5-6. The signs surrounding John's birth, the miraculous conception, the divine naming, the father's prophetic utterance, mark him as no ordinary child. The statement that the hand of the Lord was with him further cements this idea. In Jewish tradition, the hand of the Lord indicates divine presence and favor, especially upon prophets and deliverers. A life of wilderness preparation. Verse 80 concludes the infancy narrative by summarizing John's early years. He grew, became strong in spirit, and lived in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance. For a Jewish audience, the wilderness, or midbar in Hebrew, is a rich and evocative theme. It is the place where Israel was formed as God's people, where Moses encountered the burning bush, and where Elijah fled and heard the still, small voice of God. The wilderness is both a place of testing and of divine revelation. It is not a retreat from reality but a spiritual preparation ground. John's time in the wilderness places him squarely within the prophetic tradition. It echoes the pattern of the Nazarites, figures like Samson and Samuel, who were set apart from birth for divine service. Though Luke doesn't state explicitly that John was a Nazarite, his ascetic lifestyle and his separation from society suggest a similar consecration. In a time when Israel longed for redemption and the restoration of God's kingdom, such a figure would be seen not as an eccentric but as a likely herald of God's coming action.
Conclusion. Luke's account of John the Baptist's birth is not merely a story of personal joy, it is a theological proclamation rooted in Jewish memory and expectation. From the miraculous birth to the act of circumcision, the prophetic naming, and the wilderness preparation, every detail is steeped in Jewish tradition and signals that God is once again at work in Israel. The child born to Elizabeth and Zechariah is not just a son to aging parents, he is a sign that the age of the prophets is returning, that the covenant is alive, and that God's promises are nearing fulfillment. For those who lived under Roman occupation and longed for divine deliverance, the question, "What then will this child be?" was not theoretical, it was a plea, a hope, and a spark of eschatological light. Thank you. Happy feast to all.